my dad to do a commercial for Nabisco Premium Saltines.
Sure makes this dip taste creamy.
And enough.
Chef Boyardee, complete spaghetti dinner with meat sauce.
What if the best meals you will ever taste take just 10 minutes, and history nearly erased them? These are the forgotten recipes that once fed a nation, vanished from the spotlight, and are ready for a comeback. Let us rediscover the forgotten 10-minute recipes you need to eat in your lifetime. Tomato Soupcake Toasties were the kind of recipe that made you stop and wonder how someone ever thought of it. And then take a second bite because somehow it just worked. Born out of the Great Depression and carried quietly through the war years, this one was pure resourceful genius. Imagine a soft, spiced cake made with tomato soup instead of milk, sliced and pan-fried like French toast. The result was a sweet, savory creation that had just enough cinnamon and clove to confuse your senses in the best possible way. It was frugal, filling, and oddly fancy for what it cost. Grandmothers across the country swore by it for brunches, quick desserts, and even packed lunches. The weird part? Once you try it, you will wonder why it ever disappeared. And just when you think it could not get any simpler than cake from soup, wait until you see what people used to do with just a can of corn and some saltines. Creamed corn on saltines was not just a snack, it was a lifeline. This was the no-cook, no-fuss solution your grandmother reached for when money was thin and the pantry looked bare. A plate of plain saltine crackers would be laid out, and on top went spoonfuls of creamed corn, straight from the can. No frills, no baking, just open, scoop, and serve. It was salty, slightly sweet, and had that perfect contrast of crunch and cream that made it strangely addictive. Some folks added a touch of pepper, others sprinkled cheese when they had it, but most kept it exactly how it was meant to be: plain, honest food. It was not glamorous, and that was the point. It was American ingenuity on a cracker, and for those who grew up with it, it tasted like home. Of course, if you really want to talk about strange combinations that somehow just clicked, wait until you meet the dessert that astronauts accidentally made trendy. Tang Pie Cups were the wild little treat you never knew you needed. Picture this: whipped topping, condensed milk, and a few spoonfuls of Tang orange drink mix blended into a citrusy, sweet mousse, then spooned into graham cracker crusts or little jelly jars. It was a dessert that looked fancy but cost nearly nothing, and it rode the coattails of America's obsession with all things space age. Tang had taken over breakfast tables thanks to the astronauts, and homemakers wasted no time figuring out how to turn it into a treat. These pie cups became a weeknight sensation, showing up at potlucks, lunchboxes, and after-school kitchen counters. They chilled fast, set firm, and could be made in bulk. It was retro dessert science, and it worked. But if you thought dessert with a powdered drink was impressive, let us take a sharp turn into something far more savory and just as strangely satisfying. Pickle dogs were exactly what they sound like, and somehow even better. Take a hot dog, smear it with a layer of cream cheese, then roll it up with a dill pickle spear inside. That was it. 3 ingredients. 10 minutes. A cold lunch classic from the 1960s that absolutely refuses to apologize for how weird it looks. And it should not, because it was fast, cheap, and, if you ask anyone who grew up with them, unreasonably delicious. These were packed into lunchboxes across the country, wrapped in wax paper, or tucked between 2 slices of white bread. Some folks sliced them into rounds for parties and called them Pickle Dog Bites. Others just ate them straight from the fridge. It was a roller coaster in a bite, and no one knew why it worked, just that it did. But hey, if a pickle could make a hot dog better, wait until you see what a can of Spam could do with just a little applesauce. Spam and applesauce skillet bites were a staple of every good church potluck, backyard picnic, and midnight snack raid in the 1950s and 60s. Spam, already beloved for how easy it was to slice and fry, got a major upgrade when paired with the sweet tang of applesauce. The trick was simple. Dice up your Spam, toss it in a hot pan until the edges crisped, then drizzle in a little applesauce and let the sugar caramelize. The result was a golden brown, sticky sweet glaze that hugged each cube of salty pork in a syrupy hug. It was comfort food that required no effort and delivered every time. The best part? You could make it in under 10 minutes and still feel like you pulled off something impressive. But for our next forgotten recipe, let us take a bite out of the stovetop favorite that turned two pantry staples into pasta perfection. Ketchup noodle curls were the kind of thing that made no sense on paper, but made perfect sense in a hungry kitchen. You took whatever noodles you had, elbow macaroni, spaghetti, broken up ramen, boiled them soft, tossed them in a pat of butter, and then squeezed on a generous swirl of ketchup. That was it. Dinner or lunch, or maybe even breakfast, depending on how tight things were. It was the ultimate back pocket recipe, born from the kind of pantry that always had just enough but never more. Some added a sprinkle of cheese if they had it, others went wild and cracked in an egg. But most just kept it plain and honest. It was the dish you made when time ran out and money did too. If you have never had ketchup noodles before, do not knock it until you try it. And if you thought that was scrappy, just wait until you see what happens when fried rice meets the humble lunch meat hero of the pantry. Bologna coin-fried rice was pure post-war poetry. Take a cold bowl of leftover rice, usually from the night before, sometimes the week before, and toss it into a hot pan. Dice up a few thick slices of bologna cut into little coin-sized rounds and fry them until they start to curl at the edges. Add a splash of soy sauce, maybe a dash of Worcestershire if you were feeling fancy, and stir until it all browned up just enough. It was like every international flavor you had ever dreamed of, filtered through an American pantry, and the whole thing came together in 10 minutes or less, making it perfect for late-night cravings or early morning leftovers. It was a little bit of everything in one pan. But if you want to talk about strange sandwiches that somehow earned a place in family memories, you will want to take a bite out of this next leafy, sticky, surprising classic. Peanut butter and lettuce sandwiches were once as normal as peanut butter and jelly, if not more so. They might sound like a dare today, but for decades, this was a lunchtime standard across schools, factories, and family tables. You took a soft slice of white bread, slathered it with peanut butter, creamy or chunky depending on the household, and layered on a crisp piece of iceberg lettuce. Sometimes it was tucked between two slices of bread, sometimes it was an open-faced affair. Either way, it was cool, crunchy, and oddly refreshing. The lettuce balanced the stickiness of the peanut butter in a way that made each bite lighter and cleaner than you would expect. Some added a dash of salt. It was a Depression-era solution that carried through the war and lingered into the 50s and 60s before quietly fading from most lunchboxes. But if you ever try it today, you will see why it lasted as long as it did. And speaking of surprising treats with serious staying power, let us talk about the dessert Grandma always kept chilled for herself. Instant coffee jelly cubes were a delicacy for grown-ups in the days when luxury had to come from a little packet of powder. The concept was simple. Dissolve unflavored gelatin in hot water, stir in a few spoonfuls of instant coffee, and chill until firm. What you got was a wobbly, coffee-scented treat that felt just indulgent enough to pass as dessert, especially when topped with a dollop of whipped cream or evaporated milk. It was a favorite among housewives, grandmothers, and anyone who needed a quiet pick-me-up at the end of a long, exhausting day. They were classy, caffeinated, and cool. And best of all, they made you feel like you were treating yourself even when the pantry said otherwise. It was coffee, but it was fun. And if you think that was creative, wait until you see what people did with canned tuna, potato slices, and one lonely slice of cheese. Tuna tater stackers were one of those microwave miracles that made you feel like you were building something special out of absolutely nothing. Take a few thick-cut potato slices, microwave them until soft, and then layer them like bricks in a cheesy tower. In between each slice, add a spoonful of canned tuna, maybe mixed with a little mayo or mustard if you had it. Top the whole thing with a slice of American cheese, zap it again until melted, and you had what passed as a mini casserole for one. It was fast, easy, and endlessly customizable. Some folks added peas, others sprinkled breadcrumbs on top before that final zap. But everyone agreed on one thing. It was a lifesaver when dinner needed to happen fast and the fridge looked bare. Now, if you think that was creative, let us take a look at one of the wildest hot dog recipes to ever hit a vintage cookbook. Cornflake-topped hot dog boats were the kind of recipe you found in the back of a spiral-bound community cookbook, right next to tuna surprise and tomato aspic. It was humble, homespun brilliance. You took a hot dog, split it down the middle without cutting all the way through, then stuffed it with chopped pickles, relish, or even leftover mashed potatoes if you were feeling wild. On top of that, a thick wedge of cheese, American or cheddar, depending on what you had. But the real kicker came last. A generous sprinkle of crushed cornflakes, usually the stale kind at the bottom of the box, pressed right into the top before the whole thing was broiled under high heat until the flakes toasted golden and the cheese bubbled like a lava flow. It was sweet, salty, crunchy, and gooey all at once. But if you think hot dogs had all the fun, just wait until you hear how mid-century moms turned tiny fish into toast-top royalty. Sardine toast slather was the kind of thing that either makes you smile with nostalgia or wrinkle your nose with curiosity. But back in the 1950s and 60s, this was a go-to snack, especially for busy moms who knew how to make a pantry stretch. You started with a tin of sardines, drained and mashed with a fork until it resembled a paste. Then you added a dollop of yellow mustard, a bit of diced onion, and sometimes a splash of vinegar or hot sauce if you were bold. That mixture was generously smeared onto toasted rye bread, hearty enough to hold the weight, and eaten warm or cold. It was sharp, salty, and packed with flavor, the kind of thing that lingered in your memory the same way its scent lingered in the kitchen. It was quick, filling, and full of protein, which made it perfect for a working lunch or a something quick before dinner fix. And like most of these forgotten recipes, it was made with whatever was around and made to work. Still, if sardines are not your thing, the next dish is a whole lot softer and sweeter, and it comes chilled, straight from the South. Sweet milk and crumbled biscuit bowls were more than just breakfast. They were a Southern comfort tradition passed from one weary morning to the next. If you had leftover biscuits from the night before, they got new life the next day in this chilled treat. The method: crumble the biscuits into a bowl, pour over some sweet milk, also known as whole milk with a spoonful or two of sugar stirred in, and let it soak just enough to soften the biscuit without turning it into mush. Some versions added a splash of vanilla or a few sliced strawberries, but most kept it plain and simple. And it was a sweet escape from the harder meals of the week. This was how you treated yourself when dessert was off the menu and groceries were running low. It was also one of the first things kids learned to make on their own. But if biscuits and milk are not your idea of a wake-up call, the next dish will bring a cheesy Southern swirl back into your morning. Velvita Grits Swirl was the fast food breakfast of choice long before drive-thrus and donut chains ruled the morning. If you grew up in the American South in the 1970s, chances are this dish was on your plate at least once a week, maybe more. It started with a bubbling pot of grits, the kind that cooked up in 5 minutes flat and stuck to your ribs like good intentions. Into that creamy base went a generous chunk of Velveeta cheese, stirred until it melted into a golden swirl of smooth, salty comfort. Some folks added a dash of black pepper or a spoonful of margarine. It was rich, filling, and easy to make in big batches, which is exactly why it became a favorite at church breakfasts, diner counters, and crowded family tables. It disappeared slowly as instant breakfast took over, but one spoonful will remind you why it held on so long. Still, not every old-school breakfast had to be savory. Some were as wiggly and sweet as a dance floor on prom night. JellO and cottage cheese parfaits were the colorful, jiggly treat that made the 1950s look like a buffet of neon dreams. Layered in tall glasses or clear dessert cups, they were part snack, part salad, and part mystery. It started with cubes of JellO. Lime, cherry, or orange were the usual picks, cut into bite-sized squares. Those got layered with scoops of cottage cheese, sometimes sweetened with a spoonful of fruit preserves or crushed pineapple. The result was a texture lover's paradise: smooth, chewy, creamy, and cool. And despite how strange it sounds today, it was actually seen as a balanced dish: protein, fruit, and a bit of sugar, all in one. You either loved it or you pushed it around the plate, but it always made an impression. It was food that danced in the light and wiggled on the way down. But if you think that was bold, the next recipe fried up something even simpler, and did it all with just a slice of bread and a jar of mayonnaise. Before avocado toast stole the spotlight, there was mayonnaise fried toast. It was a no-nonsense fix when butter was low, cheese was out, and time was ticking. You would take a slice of soft white bread, preferably day-old and a little dry, and spread a thick layer of mayonnaise on one side. Then, drop it mayo side down in a hot skillet. That was it. No flipping, no toppings. The mayonnaise would sizzle and crisp up into a golden brown crust that tasted shockingly like it came from a corner diner griddle. It was savory, buttery, and crispy in a way that no one expected mayonnaise could pull off. During lean times, it filled the role of butter and oil while still making a piece of bread feel like something special. It was especially loved in rural kitchens, where mayo was always stocked and bread was stretched as far as it could go. And speaking of stretching snacks into something bigger, let us visit the sweet and salty stack that showed up next to every mug of tea on your aunt's porch. Apple butter and saltine stacks were a snack with a story, and usually your aunt told it while pouring you a glass of Lipton. This was not a dessert, not exactly a sandwich, and not quite a cracker plate either. It lived in its own little space of Southern tradition and back porch simplicity. You started with a stack of saltine crackers, spread a generous smear of apple butter across each one, and kept stacking until you had a small, sweet tower. The saltiness of the cracker mixed with the spiced, sticky apple butter in a way that felt like dessert without ever trying to be. It was cheap, easy, and did not need a fridge or oven, just a knife and a little care. These little stacks were served with afternoon tea, late-night coffee, or slipped into lunchboxes wrapped in wax paper. And no matter how simple it was, it never felt like a second-rate treat. But if you thought stacking crackers was creative, wait until you see what happened when cereal met French toast. Frosted Flake crusted French toast was a Saturday morning miracle. 1 part sugar rush, 1 part leftover management. You took stale sandwich bread, dipped it into a simple egg and milk batter, and then pressed each slice into a plate of crushed frosted flakes. The sugary coating clung to the surface like armor, and once you dropped it into a hot buttered skillet, the flakes crisped up into a golden caramelized crust. The result? Crunchy outside, fluffy inside, and way more exciting than your standard diner-style French toast. Syrup was optional. Powdered sugar was a bonus. And the dish had a way of turning even a sleepy kitchen into something that felt like a diner from a television show. The best part was that it cost next to nothing, and it tasted like it cost a fortune. But if you thought breakfast was done being weird and wonderful, just wait until you meet the ring of bologna that cradled your egg like it was meant to be there. Egg in a Bologna ring was breakfast magic, pure and simple. You started by slicing a ring into a thick slice of bologna, either by cutting a small hole in the middle or folding the edge to shape, and then tossing it into a sizzling pan. Once the bologna started to curl and crisp, you cracked an egg right into the center. The egg cooked neatly inside its salty, sizzling border, soaking up flavor from the meat while holding its sunny side-up charm. It was a fun twist on the classic egg in a hole, but cheaper, quicker, and way more flavorful. No need for toast when bologna had your back. It was fast, filling, and felt just rebellious enough to make kids love it and adults pretend they only made it for the kids. It came straight from the 1960s kitchen playbook, back when everyone was experimenting with processed meats and fry anything philosophies. And speaking of inventions that did not need meat to win you over, our next stop proves that a box of crackers could do the job just fine. Ritz cracker meatless loaf slices were the post-war solution to a missing protein and a shrinking grocery budget. With meat rationed or just plain too expensive, people turned to the humble cracker as a substitute base for something hearty. You started by crushing Ritz crackers into crumbs. Fine, buttery crumbs that practically melted in your fingers. Then you added milk, egg, and seasoning. Onion powder, garlic salt, maybe a bit of parsley if you had it. Mix it all together until it held its shape. Press it into a loaf pan, or shape it into patties and fry it in a pan until golden brown on both sides. What came out was something between a croquette and a breakfast sausage patty, crispy on the outside, soft and savory in the middle. You could eat it plain, serve it with gravy, or sandwich it between 2 slices of toast. It was cheap, clever, and comforting. But if you are looking for a meatless meal that looks as wild as it sounds, just wait until we serve you cheese and pineapple in a lettuce cup. Pineapple and cheese salad cups were the gelatin-adjacent fever dream that somehow made its way to every church potluck and bridge club luncheon from the 1950s to the 1970s. These were not your modern mason jar salads or picture-perfect Pinterest plates. No, these were unapologetically odd. You started with a crisp leaf of iceberg lettuce shaped into a little edible bowl. In went a ring or chunk of canned pineapple, a spoonful of shredded cheddar cheese, and a generous dollop of mayonnaise, sometimes whipped together, sometimes just layered like strata. It was tangy, creamy, sweet, and salty all at once. The pineapple added a juicy punch, the cheddar brought the bite, and the mayo somehow tied it all together in a way that still confuses the taste buds. Ladies in gloves and pearls swore by it. These days, it may get a side eye from the brunch crowd, but back then it was as much about presentation as it was about flavor. And speaking of presentation, wait until you see what people were sliding between 2 slices of bread straight from the fridge. Cold spaghetti sandwiches were the working man's reward, packed into wax paper and brown bags from coast to coast. Imagine last night's spaghetti, tangled, chilled, and maybe even a little stiff, scooped directly onto white sandwich bread, folded over, and eaten without apology. It was not warmed up, it was not fancy, and it was never pretty, but it filled you up and it did not cost a thing. There was no wrong way to build it, just leftover pasta and the kind of bread that left crumbs on your shirt. This was the lunch of truck drivers, factory workers, and after-school kids who could not wait for dinner. It was cheap, fast, and endlessly repeatable. And when times were tight, this sandwich was exactly the kind of thing that reminded people that a full belly mattered more than perfect flavor. Still, if cold noodles on bread are a stretch for you, the next dish took a canned meat spread and turned it into something hot, melty, and surprisingly satisfying. Deviled ham and pickled toast melts were the open-faced sandwich you never saw coming, but once you tried it, you could not forget it. This was lunch in the post-war pantry, when every cupboard held a can of Underwood deviled ham and every fridge had a jar of pickles waiting to be chopped. You started with a slice of bread, usually white or rye, and spread a thick layer of the deviled ham across it. Then came the diced pickles, sweet, dill, or whatever you had, and a square of American cheese slapped right on top. Into the broiler it went until the cheese bubbled and browned at the edges, forming a molten crown over that salty, tangy mix below. People served these for lunch, for dinner, and even as after-school snacks when kids came stomping through the door looking for something real. And somehow, it always delivered. But if you thought that was a creative twist on toast, just wait until we swap the milk for orange juice in your next breakfast classic. Orange juice French toast was the breakfast curveball that actually hit the sweet spot. Back in the 1970s, when cereal boxes came with recipes and orange juice was the breakfast king, someone decided to swap the usual milk and cinnamon for a splash of pure citrus sunshine. The result? A tangy, zesty twist on French toast that somehow tasted like summer mornings in California. You made it the same way as the original. Beat a few eggs, soak your slices of bread, and pan-fry them in butter. But instead of milk, you used orange juice, maybe with a pinch of sugar or nutmeg. The toast cooked up golden and crisp, with just enough of that citrus edge to feel like something special. It was the kind of thing you made when you ran out of milk and then kept making because it just worked. But if orange juice French toast surprised you, wait until you hear about the sandwich that combined peanut butter, crispy bacon, and pure roadside diner joy. Peanut butter and bacon sandwiches were a bold blend of sweet, salty, smoky magic. This was the kind of thing you picked up from a roadside diner or learned about from your cousin who swore it changed their life. You started with 2 slices of sandwich bread, white, wheat, whatever was on hand, and spread a thick layer of peanut butter across one or both. Then came the bacon, crispy, crumbled, or sometimes just whole strips laid right across the top. The peanut butter melted slightly from the heat of the bacon, turning sticky, rich, and deeply satisfying. Some folks added honey. Others used chunky peanut butter for extra crunch. But everyone who tried it agreed it should not have worked, and yet somehow it did. It was filling, affordable, and had just enough rebellious charm to make it feel like a treat. Whether served at summer cookouts, tucked into lunchboxes, or snuck in as a late-night snack, this sandwich was a forgotten favorite that deserved a second chance. And if you thought that flavor combination was bold, the next dish takes shredded lunch meat, coleslaw dressing, and wraps it up in a tortilla that screams 1985. Quick Bologna slaw wraps were a time capsule straight out of a neon-lit kitchen in 1985. This was the dish you made when there was no dinner plan, just a fridge full of sandwich meat and a half-empty bottle of coleslaw dressing. You took slices of bologna, any brand, any cut, stacked them up and shredded them like you were prepping for a backyard cookout. Then came the slaw dressing, creamy and tangy, poured right over the top and stirred until the whole mixture glistened like a picnic salad. Some folks tossed in shredded cabbage or carrots, others just let the bologna shine. Scoop that into a tortilla, roll it up tight, and you had a cold wrap that somehow tasted like a summer road trip. It was rich, salty, sweet, and didn't need a stove, which made it perfect for lunchboxes, poolside snacks, or a quick bite before a big night of watching rented movies on VHS. It was easy to make, easy to eat, and gone before you knew it. And if you think that sounds retro, just wait until you see how people turned powdered milk into the frozen treat of childhood dreams. Carnation instant milk pops were the kind of frozen snack you made when there was no ice cream in sight and no money to buy any. Powdered milk, a kitchen essential during tighter times, took on a new life in this simple, chilly treat. You mixed the powdered milk with water, stirred in sugar to taste, and added a splash of vanilla for that sweet, creamy edge. Pour it into paper cups, drop in a wooden stick, or a plastic spoon if that's all you had, and freeze until solid. The result? A homemade popsicle that was cool, milky, and surprisingly comforting. Some families added mashed bananas, instant coffee, or cocoa powder to shake things up, but the original vanilla version was the favorite for a reason. These milk pops felt like summer camp, backyard sprinklers, and dollar store toys all rolled into one. You did not need a fancy freezer or a name brand label, just a little patience and a little powdered magic. But if you are craving something warmer and toastier, the next recipe takes the military's most infamous dish and gives it a golden, crispy upgrade. Chipped beef toast roll-ups were what happened when someone looked at creamed chipped beef on toast, also known as SOS, and thought, what if this was fancy? You started by making the usual white sauce, flour, butter, milk, and a handful of chopped, salty chipped beef. Once it thickened up into a rich, creamy gravy, you spread a spoonful across a slice of white sandwich bread. The trick was to roll it up tight, like a cigar, and then toast it in a buttered skillet until the outside turned crisp and golden. What came out looked like an hors d'oeuvre and tasted like a diner breakfast wrapped in a hug. These roll-ups were fast, cheap, and somehow elegant despite being built from rations and leftovers. Some families added a sprinkle of paprika on top. Others served them with a side of scrambled eggs or sliced tomato. Whatever the variation, it was comfort food disguised as something elevated. It made you feel like you were eating high-end hotel brunch with ingredients straight out of a wartime pantry. But if that's too dainty for your taste, the next dish throws everything into one dish and bakes it until bubbling. Canned chili and oyster cracker casserole was the dump-and-bake dinner that did not ask questions. It just showed up and did the job. You started with a can of chili, any kind, beans, no beans, spicy or mild, and poured it into a baking dish. Then you took a couple handfuls of oyster crackers, those tiny round ones from the soup aisle, and scattered them over the top like breadcrumbs. Some families added cheese, shredded or sliced, just enough to melt into the crevices. Others tossed in chopped onion or whatever stray vegetable was about to turn in the fridge. Into the oven, or the toaster oven, it went for just a few minutes. The crackers crisped up, the chili thickened, and suddenly you had something that tasted like it took hours, but barely lasted 10 minutes. It was perfect for cold nights, quick lunches, or feeding a group with a single can and some dry goods. And the best part? It cost less than $1, but never felt like a compromise. Of course, if you are a fan of turning pantry staples into something creative, just wait until you see what happens when you pour leftover potatoes into a waffle iron. Instant mashed potato waffles were the kind of recipe that made you feel like a kitchen wizard. You started with leftover instant mashed potatoes, the kind made from flakes and hot water, probably from dinner the night before. Stir in an egg, maybe a little flour or shredded cheese if you had it, and season with salt, pepper, or whatever spices you trusted. Then came the fun part. Scoop that mixture into a preheated waffle iron and press it down. The steam hissed, the edges sizzled, and in just a few minutes, out came a golden brown waffle with crispy ridges and a soft, creamy middle. It was crispy comfort in the form of something totally unexpected. You could top it with sour cream, green onions, bacon bits, or just a drizzle of butter. Serve it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It never missed. This was how you made something impressive without spending a dime more than you already had. And if you thought potatoes were versatile, just wait until you see how cereal milk turned into an after-school dream that somehow still had adults sneaking seconds. The club sandwich was never shy about making an entrance. This was the sandwich equivalent of wearing a tuxedo to a barbecue. Triple layered, cut diagonally, and always served with a cocktail toothpick jabbed right through the middle like a victory flag, the classic clubhouse was a masterclass in controlled chaos. You had turkey, ham, and bacon stacked with lettuce, tomato, and mayonnaise on white toast, then doubled up like it had something to prove. One bite, and you got the salty crunch of bacon, the cool snap of lettuce, the savory chew of ham, and that creamy mayo keeping everything glued together. It was tall. It was filling. It was an edible tower of American lunch pride. You could find it at diners, roadside motels, airport cafes, and your Aunt Linda's house on a Sunday afternoon. No one ever finished a club sandwich without looking like they'd just solved a puzzle. Picking it up was half the battle. Eating it cleanly? Impossible. But satisfying? Always. This was the sandwich you ordered when you wanted to feel like you were doing something important. And while this one wore its sandwich royalty crown proudly, the next one took a completely different route, turning cheap lunch meat into the closest thing we ever got to pizza on a bun. We also had chicken Marbella, which rivaled beef options like beef hash. Americans have always enjoyed an incredible variety of food. Popular American chefs Julie Rosso and Sheila Lukens popularized and invented chicken Marbella, a dish made using chicken, prunes, olives, and capers. The recipe was first seen in the Silver Palette cookbook. The cookbook recipe was very popular in the Jewish community and quickly became popular amongst larger groups of people across America. Towards the 80s, chefs across the country decided that the chicken Marbella needed a revamp. This decision would prove costly as people started disapproving of the dish when chefs added sun-dried tomatoes instead of olives. Clearly, they went a bit overboard, and people began to refrain from ordering the chicken Marbella. In a frenzy, dinner joints had to remove the chicken Marbella from the menu until they could go back to the original recipe. Since then, restaurants have stuck to the OG flavor more keenly. A crisp autumn day in the 1970s wasn't complete without a trip to the local farm stand. Fresh apples, homemade pies, and of course, a jug of unpasteurized apple cider, cloudy, rich, and straight from the press. It was a seasonal tradition, the kind of drink you poured into a glass and sipped cold, or warmed up on the stove with a cinnamon stick. No labels, no expiration dates, just fresh pressed fruit in its purest form. For generations, farm-fresh juices were a staple, especially in rural areas where people trusted their local orchards. The juice was made by simply crushing fruit and collecting the liquid. No heat treatment, no extra processing, and because it wasn't filtered, it had that distinct, pulpy texture that store-bought juice just couldn't match. But as food safety research advanced, so did concerns over harmful bacteria like E. coli and salmonella. Unpasteurized juice, while natural, carried risks especially for children and the elderly. By the 1990s, regulations tightened, requiring warning labels and, in many cases, pasteurization for commercial sale. There is something dangerously comforting about mixing bacon grease with anything sweet, and that is exactly what bacon and apple butter on white bread was. You take crisp, salty bacon, still warm from the skillet, and press it into a slice of soft white bread that has been generously smeared with apple butter. That is it. No lettuce, no cheese, no rules. The combination was 100% homemade magic. It tasted like fall mornings, cast iron skillets, and someone's grandma telling you not to eat too fast. Apple butter gave it this rich, spiced flavor that clung to your mouth just long enough for the bacon to come crashing through. It was smoky. It was sweet. It was not trying to impress anyone. The real win here was in how it reused leftovers. If breakfast was done, and you had a few stray strips of bacon and a jar of apple butter on hand, this sandwich practically made itself. The kind of thing you whipped up while the coffee was still brewing. Maybe it never made it to a diner menu, but it made it to enough hearts to matter. And speaking of sandwiches that mattered, let us talk about the skyscraper of cold cuts that ruled every diner plate with a toothpick flag on top. Bushmeat, on the other hand, is something that carries a natural risk to it. No human interference needed this time. This is an umbrella term that refers to all kinds of animals caught in the wilds of Africa for daily sustenance. And when we say all kinds, please take that to heart. Bats, lions, as well as monkeys, literally nothing is off the table. These wild animals carry diseases with them. And during the Ebola outbreak from 2013 to 2016, governments started banning the hunting and consumption of bushmeat. It is still smuggled in illegally, though, and it goes for a pretty hefty price. Imagine being 8 years old and opening your lunchbox to find chopped olive and cream cheese on pumpernickel. Either your mom was ahead of her time, or she found an old cocktail recipe card and just went with it. This sandwich was salty, tangy, creamy, and somehow kind of grown up. You had green olives chopped so fine they could sneak into your taste buds before your brain caught on, mixed with cream cheese until it was a spread so thick it stuck to the knife like it had a mission. All of that smeared onto a slice of deep, dark pumpernickel that practically demanded you respect it. It was not flashy, it was not sweet, and no kid was trading their cookie for it, but it had an edge, the kind of flavor that got better the more you chewed. Somewhere along the way, this party appetizer snuck into lunchboxes, Tupperware, and even a few kitchen counters at 2 in the morning. It was strange, but it made sense. The 70s were weird like that. Spreads were suddenly sandwiches and finger food was fair game. Of course, if you thought cold spreads were wild, wait until you see what happens when tuna salad goes face to face with a broiler. Grits with cheese were one of the staples of Southern eating and culture for the longest time before Americans moved on from cornmeal. Hey, I get it. I'd probably tire of it if it was one of the only things I grew up on. People were just used to eating corn in all of its forms, and cornmeal was one of the most popular and normalized ones. As a result, cornmeal grits were common in most homes. Breakfast, lunch, or dinner, it really didn't matter. People could honestly just walk into a diner and expect them to serve grits. You didn't even have to take a look at the menu since any roadside place worth its property value in salt would be serving one. Hell, they were easy enough to make at home. The cheese addition also made it a lot more palatable and made more Americans willing to try it. As far as Southern staples go, this one gets some use still, but only by old heads who remember the days of when you would have this for comfort food instead of a Big Mac and extra large fries. The patty melt was not just a sandwich, it was a lifestyle. It belonged to truck stops, corner booths, and places where the waitress calls you hon. Start with a beef patty, not too thick, not too thin, grilled until the edges charred just enough. Then pile on caramelized onions so sweet they practically melt, and drop a couple of slices of Swiss cheese on top until it oozes over like lava. But the crown jewel? That rye bread, buttered and toasted right on the griddle. It soaked up everything. The beefy drippings, the onion sweetness, the crispy edges of the cheese. Every bite was a perfect mix of crunchy and gooey, salty and buttery. You were not just eating a sandwich, you were biting into pure diner energy. People had this at lunch and still talked about it at dinner. If your parents ever made this at home, you were one of the lucky ones. And if not, you probably still remember your first time trying one and realizing a sandwich could actually stop time. But not every sandwich needed to be hot off the grill. Some came cold, weirdly fancy, and straight from the pages of a church cookbook. 7-layer salad, on the other hand, goes back to the greener side of things, and you might get a little intimidated with a name like that. It's no 3-layer cake, as in, you will still be able to eat other things once you're done with this, so don't worry. It's actually this potluck dish that first popped up during the 1950s in the Midwest, and the reason it got that name is because of the way it's set up. Imagine, for just a second, lots of ingredients like iceberg lettuce, hard-boiled eggs, bacon, cheese, and mayo dressing, all layered up one by one in a clear dish. You can now see why the 7-layer aspect caught on. Plus, it wasn't just that this dish was really healthy and flavorful. It got popular for other reasons too. Most of the ingredients I just mentioned were things you could get under $5 total if you didn't already have them lying around. And in the 70s, especially during America's post-war period, people were tired. They were tired of the economy failing and rationing, all struggling to make ends meet. Long story short, they wanted food that was easy to make and prepare. Out with the 2-hour-long lasagnas and meatloaf and in with the salads and sandwiches, I suppose. So now you have a dish that looks good, works with a potluck, and tastes even better. Of course it was going to catch on. And even today, a lot of households that had family recipes passed down still fondly make the dish. Why don't you give it a try the next time you're looking for gut-healthy food? Since it is America we're talking about, it wasn't all ideal nutrition and calorically smart eating all the time. For every salad you hear about on this list, rest assured there were double the amounts of burgers and greasy fusion food coming out, or desserts that were sugar rushes incarnate. Vegetarian chili definitely had its heyday in the same time as those moments I was talking about. Listen, when I say movement, I don't mean a 3-day bandwagon full of peaceful sit-ins and protests like we have today. I mean, like nationally, parents everywhere were livid. They couldn't stand that their kids were actually preferring to stay inside with a McDonald's Happy Meal and the television screen, and lots of them became super proactive about their family's diet and eating habits because of the massive revamp in culture. I mean, in this same century, these people went from surviving off of foraging wild mushrooms to watching moving pictures on a screen, having a magic box that just cools all their food full-time, slow cookers, the internet, computers, and God knows what else. All this to say, it was a fast-paced era, and people reacted with what they knew worked: vegetables. If the Depression proved anything, it was that there was a massive problem with people's diets. It wasn't economical, and it definitely wasn't healthy, and the alternative wasn't as impossible to switch to as most people would have you believe. Circumstances like this saw the rise of vegetarian chili in vegan cookbooks, but unfortunately, it couldn't make the cut, especially in the South, where people just outright rejected it. If you were a regular at lunch counters in the 1970s, there was one cold cut that had a mysterious charm: pickle and pimento loaf. It had a look that was hard to ignore. A pale pink meat dotted with bright green pickle bits and tiny flecks of red pimento, like a mosaic made by someone who really loved sandwiches. It came sliced thin from behind the deli glass, slapped between white bread with a dab of mayonnaise, and wrapped in wax paper with a soda on the side. You did not question it. You just ate it. The flavor? Tangy, savory, and weirdly sweet, but not in a bad way. It had the texture of bologna, the bite of pickle, and the color scheme of a Christmas tree. For some reason, it vanished from most grocery shelves by the end of the decade. Maybe tastes changed, or maybe we just stopped putting pickles inside our meat. But back then, it was an easy go-to, a bit of fun, and a total conversation starter if you pulled it out during lunch break. Of course, if you thought that sandwich was messy looking, just wait until we dive into the one that was literally impossible to eat without getting sauce all over your hands and loving it. Bright, jiggly, and packed with unexpected ingredients, gelatin salads were a staple at potlucks, holiday gatherings, and church suppers. Few embodied the era's love for playful food quite like 7-Up salad, a sweet and citrusy concoction that combined lime jello, crushed pineapple, mini marshmallows, and of course, 7-Up for an extra fizzy lift. The fascination with gelatin-based dishes stretched back decades, but by the mid-20th century, food manufacturers were marketing them as versatile, family-friendly options. JellO was no longer just a simple dessert. It was the foundation for countless salads that often blurred the line between side dish and dessert. Adding soda to the mix wasn't just about flavor, it introduced aeration, making the texture lighter and giving it a slightly effervescent quality. It required no baking, minimal prep, and could be made in advance, perfect for busy households. Some versions even folded in cream cheese or whipped topping for a creamier finish. Today, gelatin salads have become more of a nostalgic novelty than an everyday dish, but 7-Up salad remains a quirky reminder of a time when food was just as much about fun as it was about flavor. Creamed chipped beef on toast, or as anyone who ever served in the military will tell you, SOS. No, not a cry for help, though it looked like one. This was dried beef, shredded and stirred into a thick, milky white sauce with a bit of pepper and sometimes a touch of Worcestershire if you were fancy. Then it got spooned over toast, or biscuits, or whatever bread you had. It was a direct descendant of World War II rations. But by the 1970s, it had made its way into American homes, school cafeterias, and greasy spoon diners across the country. It was salty. It was creamy. It looked like a mistake, but somehow, it kept getting made and loved. It was affordable, filling, and tasted better than it had any right to. Parents made it because it used cheap pantry ingredients. Diners served it with coffee refills. Kids ate it because they did not know any better, then grew up craving it again. It might not be pretty, but it is unforgettable. Still, not everything on this list is heavy. Some sandwiches were just simple, clever ways to use what was left on the breakfast table, and a little sweet on the side. Canned tuna was cheap, packed with protein, and could be turned into everything from tuna salad sandwiches to casseroles. Families relied on it for quick meals, and no one thought twice about how much they ate. Back then, there were no warning labels, no recommendations to limit consumption, just endless recipes encouraging people to make the most of their pantry supply. But there was a hidden problem. Industrial pollution had been steadily increasing mercury levels in ocean fish, and tuna, being a top predator, was absorbing more than its fair share. By 1970, reports surfaced linking mercury in tuna to potential neurological damage, particularly in pregnant women and young children. The FDA took action, setting limits on mercury levels in fish, but there was no official warning on cans. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the government issued clear guidelines advising consumers, especially expectant mothers, to limit their intake of certain tuna varieties. Despite the concerns, canned tuna never disappeared from store shelves. It's still a go-to meal for millions, but with a little more caution attached. Now, Bologna is not what you would call glamorous, but in the 1970s, someone took that humble meat and turned it into a straight-up miracle. Enter the Bologna pizza sandwich. This was not a joke, it was genius. You start with a soft hamburger bun, maybe left over from the weekend cookout. On the bottom half, you lay down a slice of Bologna, and if you are doing it right, you give it a quick sizzle in a frying pan so the edges curl up like a little meatball. Then you spoon on tomato sauce, canned, homemade, whatever you have, and top it with shredded mozzarella. After that, into the broiler it goes. What comes out is pure nostalgia with melted cheese dripping down the sides and the edges of the Bologna just crispy enough to give it bite. It smelled like school lunch and after-school cartoons. This was a sandwich that did not care what anyone thought. It was pizza-inspired, budget-friendly, and full of attitude. A little greasy? Sure. A little weird? Absolutely. But no one ever forgot their first one. But if Bologna in a broiler felt like a stretch, get ready for the canned spread that showed up in lunchboxes, picnic baskets, and every pantry with a shelf of shame, and somehow stayed beloved. While you can still find raw cider at some farm stands, it often comes with a disclaimer. In the 1970s, lighting up a cigarette at the dinner table wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Restaurants had ashtrays on every table, waiters took orders through a haze of smoke, and no one batted an eye if you alternated bites of steak with puffs of a Marlboro. Whether at home, in a diner, or even on an airplane, smoking while eating was just part of the culture. Back then, cigarette ads featured doctors, Hollywood icons, and even cartoon camels, reinforcing the idea that smoking wasn't just normal, it was sophisticated. Families would gather around the table, and after a home-cooked meal, someone would light up without a second thought. At fast food joints, parents puffed away while kids unwrapped cheeseburgers. Even in fancy restaurants, a good meal was often finished with a cigarette and a cup of coffee, like some kind of ritual. But as medical studies piled up linking secondhand smoke to serious health risks, the public's tolerance started to shift. The first major bans started in the late 80s, and by the 2000s, smoking in restaurants was virtually extinct. Now this one came out of left field, unless you grew up near a Chinatown diner. The egg foo young sandwich was one of those things that made 0 sense on paper, but the second you took a bite, you stopped asking questions. Start with an egg patty, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and packed with bean sprouts, green onions, maybe a little chopped pork or shrimp if you got the good kind. Then came the gravy. Not just poured, but drenched. Thick brown gravy ladled right over the patty until it practically dripped off the sides. Slide the whole thing into a hamburger bun, close it up, and prepare yourself for the kind of meal that laughs in the face of napkins. It was heavy, hot, and heartwarming. The egg foo young sandwich felt like the kind of invention you only make when you are really hungry and just messing around in the kitchen. But in the 1970s, this was a lunchtime legend for anyone who knew where to find it. Of course, if you were not lucky enough to live near a place that served one of these, you probably grew up with something even saltier, way more military, and still showing up on diner menus today. Presentation mattered in 1970s dining, and few dishes made a bolder visual statement than salmon mousse mold. A blend of canned salmon, cream cheese, and gelatin, this pastel-hued creation was shaped in decorative molds, often fish-shaped for maximum effect. What might seem like an eccentric relic today was once a centerpiece at cocktail parties and elegant luncheons. The origins of molded fish dishes date back centuries, but by the mid-20th century, gelatin-based foods had become a symbol of sophistication. This dish was a product of two prevailing trends: the love for molded foods and the growing popularity of convenience ingredients. Canned salmon was affordable and readily available, and cream cheese provided a rich, smooth texture that balanced out the fish's briny flavor. The post-war boom had ushered in an era of aspirational cooking, where the goal was to serve something that looked as impressive as it tasted. Plating mattered, and nothing said fancy quite like an intricate molded creation sitting on a bed of greens. Today, the dish still appears in retro-themed gatherings, though modern adaptations often ditch the gelatin in favor of a spreadable mousse, served with crackers instead of in sculpted form. You know it is serious when your childhood lunch starts with a loud sizzle. Fried bologna and mustard was never supposed to be a star. It was just something people made when they ran out of ideas or groceries. But it had that wild card charm. Thick-cut bologna, the kind with that red plastic skin you had to peel off, got tossed on a hot skillet until it puffed like a mini volcano. It would curl at the edges, crispy and brown, and just when you thought it was done, it would start to sing. Slap that onto a slice of Wonder Bread, squeeze on yellow mustard like you mean it, and top it with another slice. No lettuce, no tomato, no distractions. This was the sandwich that knew what it was. It smelled like school lunches and weekend trips to the lake. It was cheap, easy, and always hit the spot. Nobody was trying to impress anybody with this. But somehow, it never let you down. The meat might have been humble, but it had attitude, and the mustard made sure it got noticed. Now, if that one felt like a memory, wait until we talk about the sandwich that brought the diner straight to your house, griddle grease and all. Did I mislead you into thinking the 70s were all about getting fit and keeping your cholesterol in the ideal range? It was also a period of exploration of other cuisines, one of those being the tiki style of eating. Tiki cuisine had a lot to take inspiration from, don't get me wrong, but one of the best parts of it was Polynesian chicken. Think of it like this sweet and tangy sauce or glaze that blessed the chicken with its thick, rich flavor. Now, the urge to take more steps towards tiki cuisine was something that was building up in the background since the 1930s, but it all really came to a head in the 1970s. In the 1930s, restaurants such as Don the Beachcomber or Trader Vic's would feature popular tiki dishes. This nationwide interest in other cuisines only really exploded as a movement in the 60s and 70s though, and Polynesian chicken was a big sign of that. It became something you couldn't separate from Mai Tai, like beer and dried fruit at a local pub. However, it wasn't exactly authentic. This American version has pineapple juice, garlic, ginger, soy sauce, and brown sugar-based sauce, and the chicken breast is marinated in that and served with stirred vegetables. The American take on it seems to up the sweetness a lot, but the original tiki variant plays up the tanginess a lot more. Retro tiki parties from the 70s would still have something that really reflected authentic Pacific Islander cuisine, but whichever version you got, you were in for a great meal. Now this one had drama. The tuna boat melt was not just a sandwich, it was an event. You start with a sub roll, soft in the middle, split open like it is waiting for a miracle. In goes a scoop of tuna salad, but not the watery kind. This was chunky, mayo-rich, maybe with a little celery if you were lucky. Then come the tomato slices, thin, juicy, and laid down like armor. And finally, cheddar cheese, shredded, sliced, whatever worked, blanketing the whole thing like a warm hug. Slide the whole sandwich under a broiler and wait. That is the moment things change. The edges of the bread crisp up, the cheese bubbles and browns, and the tomato softens just enough to soak into the tuna. You pull it out just in time to stop it from burning, but almost wish it had. This was the sandwich version of comfort food theater. It smelled like warmth. It looked like golden perfection. It tasted like something way fancier than it was. Parents made it to use up tuna, but kids remembered it like a feast. But if this one was golden, wait until you meet the sandwich that vanished from lunch counters just as fast as it appeared. In the 1970s, grabbing a snack off the grocery shelf was simple. No long ingredient lists, no allergy warnings, just food in a package. If a product contained peanuts, dairy, or wheat, it was up to the consumer to figure it out. Those with food allergies had to play detective, carefully reading labels, if they even listed all the ingredients. There were no bold warnings, no may contain statements, and certainly no standardized regulations to prevent cross-contamination. Food manufacturers weren't trying to be careless. The awareness just wasn't there. While allergies existed, they weren't as widely recognized as they are today. A peanut butter factory might also process cookies, but there was no obligation to disclose that. For those with severe allergies, eating processed food could be a game of Russian roulette. One mislabeled snack and a hospital trip wasn't out of the question. The turning point came in the late 1990s and early 2000s when food allergy cases became more widely studied, and advocacy groups pushed for better labeling. In 2004, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act was passed, requiring clear identification of the top 8 allergens. If breakfast and lunch ever had a baby, it would probably look like the Denver sandwich. And no, this has nothing to do with Colorado. It just happens to be the name that stuck. Picture this: chopped ham, bell peppers, and onions folded into a golden omelet, then squished between 2 slices of toasted white bread that crackle at the corners. It was the kind of meal that rolled straight off a diner griddle and onto your plate with no apologies. There was no syrup, no fancy garnish, just a sandwich that worked as hard as you did. People on their way to double shifts or cranking their station wagon heaters on winter mornings lived for this. It was breakfast without needing a plate, a fork, or even a break in your morning routine. The egg made it feel like something your mom would cook, while the sandwich form made it fast enough to eat one-handed while pumping gas. Somehow both comforting and chaotic, it became a regular in greasy spoons across the country. You could smell it before it even hit the table. And while the Denver sandwich was bold, our next one turned cheap meat into high art, or at least into something that sizzled like it mattered. In the 1970s, home canning was more than just a hobby. It was a way to stretch the grocery budget and keep the pantry stocked year-round. Families filled their shelves with jars of green beans, corn, and carrots, all preserved with time-tested methods passed down through generations. But while fruits and jams could be safely canned with a boiling water bath, low-acid vegetables were another story. Without a pressure cooker, those innocent-looking jars could turn into ticking time bombs for botulism. For years, many home canners relied on boiling water alone, believing that if it's sealed, it was safe. Some added aspirin or vinegar, thinking it would help ward off bacteria. Others simply trusted the process. After all, their grandparents had done it. The problem? Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria behind botulism, thrives in low oxygen, low-acid environments like improperly canned vegetables. It doesn't change the taste, smell, or appearance of food, making it nearly impossible to detect until symptoms appear. As cases of botulism poisoning mounted, food safety officials began cracking down, emphasizing the need for pressure canning. If one of these dishes sparked a memory or a craving, drop it in the comments, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe so we can keep digging up the delicious parts of history together.